There is something uniquely chaotic and also quite cool about Formula 1 games on handheld video game consoles. You're taking one of the fastest and most technologically advanced sports in the world, where teams will spend literally hundreds of millions chasing fractions of a second, and somehow compressing that into a plastic brick with a tiny screen, a D-pad, and maybe 2 buttons, if you're lucky, and yet somehow it works. Sometimes. Because across the late 80s and 90s, developers kept attempting to recreate Formula 1 on devices that realistically had no business handling something that complicated. The results, well, a bizarre mix of ambition, limitation, creativity, and occasionally, complete and utter disaster. Some of these games are surprisingly competent, and others feel like they're held together with duct tape and hope. A bit like the Williams car this season. Anyway, today we're diving into the insane world of Formula 1 handheld video games. This is not a definitive list of every single F1 handheld game ever released, but we are going to be looking at entries as early as 1989 and as recent as 2011, so a lot of ground to cover. One other small challenge I've set for myself, because I'm not very good at F1 games as much as I like them, is to at least try and get a podium finish in each one, and you'll see soon that that may not have been completely possible. Anyway, without further ado, let's begin. So first up we have Super Monaco Grand Prix, and this game released in arcades in 1989. It was developed and published by Sega and would later go on to hit a variety of platforms, including Sega's own Game Gear, and it would arrive on that platform in 1990. Whilst the original arcade game was a first-person, one-race kind of thing with just the Monaco Grand Prix, the home console versions added races and game modes based on the 1989 F1 World Championship, and due to the limitations of the Game Gear, this one went into third person, and thank God it did, honestly. Now, going into this game, a 1990 handheld racing game, my expectations were not very high. I was expecting something basic and maybe even borderline unplayable, but instead, I ended up with a game that actually understands its limitations and works around them. As I mentioned, the biggest example is the camera angle. Rather than forcing a first-person or cockpit perspective, it uses a third-person view behind the car, and that decision is huge. On a small screen, especially like one on the Game Gear, visibility really is everything. Being able to see your car and some of the track ahead instantly makes the game feel more playable. It's a design choice that feels obvious now for that kind of hardware, but at the time it shows a real awareness of what handheld gaming needed. The handling is another pleasant surprise. It's not overly complex, but it is consistent. The car feels stable, you can predict how it will behave through corners, and most importantly, you can improve. That sense of progression is key. You're not just surviving races, you are actually learning them. Now visually, yeah, of course, this is where the limitations show. The environments are extremely basic, there's very little variation between tracks, and you're not exactly getting a sense of place, even not from any backdrops. Monaco doesn't feel like Monaco, it's just another track with slightly different turns. But in a weird kind of way, I think that simplicity does help the gameplay. There's nothing distracting you, it's just you, the car, and the track. The AI is fairly straightforward too. It's not particularly aggressive, but it does enough to keep races interesting. You'll have to pick your moments, avoid mistakes, and stay consistent if you want good results. And speaking of results, I did manage to achieve my first podium here, and that was P3 at Monaco. Which in a game like this, with a skill level like mine, does actually feel like an achievement. Overall, Super Monaco GP on the Game Gear is a great example of early handheld design done right. It doesn't try to do too much, but what it does, it actually does kind of well. So moving on to the Game Boy, and things immediately get more unpredictable. This is Satoru Nakajima F1 Hero GB World Championship 91, a really nice title that just simply rolls off the tongue, and it's a game that feels like it's aiming higher than its hardware can comfortably handle. So this game was developed by Natsu System and published by Vari, and released in December of 1991 exclusively in Japan. It only had the licensing to use Nakajima's name and none of the other racers, so they all appear with slightly altered names, like instead of Senna, we've got Senna, and instead of Mansell, you've got Man-Senna, of course. So on paper it is actually promising. You've got a licensed driver, a focus on realism, and a presentation that tries to mimic a proper Formula 1 experience. But as soon as I started actually playing, the entire experience started to fall apart. The biggest issue is instability. The game is glitchy in a way that actively impacts your ability to play at all. Physics can behave oddly, the screen flickers, races don't always function as expected, and overall to me it just felt unreliable. Now I wasn't sure if this was an emulator issue, but having pulled footage elsewhere from online, it still looks kinda buggy. In my experience, finishing a race cleanly was a challenge, not because of difficulty, but because the game itself just didn't want to cooperate. And that is quite frustrating, because underneath that, there are some glimpses of something actually good. The handling on the odd moments where the game worked is actually quite nice. There's a level of control that suggests the developers were aiming for something more sim-focused than arcade, which I know is a silly statement to make on a Game Boy game, but just go with it guys. Visually I'd say it's also kinda solid for a Game Boy title, the cars are clearly defined, the track layout is somewhat readable, and there's a genuine attempt to create a sense of speed. But yeah, all of that gets overshadowed by technical issues. This is one of those games where you can see the ambition, but also the limitations of the hardware and development process at the time. There definitely are better original Game Boy F1 games out there, and if you're interested in my personal best on this game, well, it's a DNF guys. So let's just move on and pretend that never happened. Okay, so now we are moving back over to the Sega Game Gear. We move on to a game that kind of raises the stakes, not just as a racing game, but as an experience. So this is Super Monaco GP 2, or should I use its actual title, Ayrton Senna's Super Monaco GP 2. So this was once again developed and published by Sega, releasing on the Genesis, Master System, and the Game Gear in 1992. The game doesn't just drop you into a race, it introduces itself, and more importantly, introduces him. The intro alone to the championship was both terrifying and kind of iconic. A very pixelated Senna appears on screen and just tells you, "You are my rival. Good luck." And from then on out, I was terrified. That line completely reframes the experience. You're not just racing AI anymore, you're racing Senna, one of the greatest drivers in history. There's an intimidation factor here that no other handheld game at the time even attempts. It's a small detail, but it adds some personality and made the game instantly more memorable. From a presentation standpoint, this is a step up from the original Super Monaco GP. The environments are a bit more detailed, there's better use of colour, and the tracks feel more distinct from one another. You're not just driving through vague, repetitive scenery anymore, there's at least an attempt to create variation and atmosphere. But when you actually start racing, this is where things get complicated, because despite the improvements in presentation, the handling takes a noticeable step backward. Where the first game felt relatively smooth and predictable, this one feels less consistent. The car doesn't respond quite as cleanly, and it's harder to find that rhythm where everything just clicks. Corners feel slightly more awkward, and small mistakes can escalate quickly. And not only that, the sense of speed in this game is just non-existent. Everything feels like go-karts, that kind of level of speed, whereas the original actually felt like you were moving at a dangerous speed. It's not unplayable, but it's enough to notice, especially if you have played the original. This creates an interesting contrast. On the one hand, the game is more ambitious and more visually engaging, but on the other hand, the core driving experience, which is, the thing you spend most of your time doing, is definitely less refined. That said, I would say there's still plenty to enjoy here. The AI feels a bit more competitive, races have more tension, and the overall structure gives you a stronger sense of progression. You're not just driving, you're competing. So silly me thought I finally had a chance at getting P1 on one of these races. And of course I thought Brazil would be a good place to do that, but no. Naturally, Senna won, which does feel appropriate, but I did manage a P2 finish, so I will take that win. Now before we move on to our next game, if you're a fan of racing games or retro racing games, then please consider hitting that subscribe button and tapping that bell to get notified of my future uploads. Anyway, moving on. So switching back to the Game Boy and switching back to monochrome, but this time with a noticeably more refined experience. This is Ferrari Grand Prix Challenge. Developed by NMS Software and published by Acclaim, this released on both the Nintendo Entertainment System and the original Game Boy in 1992. Just to note that the NES version was developed by System 3 instead of NMS. This is one of those games that doesn't try to reinvent the wheel. Okay, sorry. Instead, it focuses on doing the basics well, and that approach works in its favour. Visually, of course, you're still dealing with the limitations of the original Game Boy, no colour, limited detail, and a very small screen, but within those constraints, the game does a solid job. The cars are clearly defined, the track is readable, and there are even small animation touches that give the game a bit of personality. It's not flashy, but it is polished, and that's really the key word I can use here, polished. Because unlike some of the earlier Game Boy F1 titles, this one feels, stable. It works, you can start a race, complete it, and feel like the game behaved as expected throughout. Handling is also a step in the right direction, it's not overly complex, but it is consistent, and you can take corners with confidence, you can learn braking points, and you can gradually improve your performance over time. It strikes a nice balance between accessibility and challenge. There's also a sense of structure to the game. You're not just jumping into random races, you're progressing, improving, and aiming for better results. And once again for me, Brazil delivers, for another P2 finish. At this point, it's become a running theme. Either Brazil is the most forgiving track in these games, or I've somehow developed a very specific skill set. Either way, at least it's consistent. Ferrari Grand Prix Challenge might not be the most ambitious game on the list, but it's one of the most reliable. It does what it sets out to do, and it does it pretty well, and sometimes that's all you need, really. Now for one final time, we return to Sega's Game Gear, and unfortunately this is where things start to dip again. So this game is simply called Formula 1, and released in 1993 for a variety of platforms including the Genesis, the Master System, the Atari ST, and of course the Game Gear. This version specifically was developed by Tech London, and was published by Domark, or Dumark, I don't know how you pronounce it, but anyway, the point is, this game's just called Formula 1. So this is a fully licensed FIA game that features all the drivers from that season, except Senna, because he'd already endorsed Super Monaco GP 2, so he is not in the game. However, every other racer is. You've got Schumacher, Damon Hill, Alan Prost, Martin Brundle, you got the whole gang here, guys. Anyway, on paper, this is a game that should be building on the foundations of previous F1 titles. Even if those previous titles weren't by the same developers, you'd think they'd take some notes, and in practice, unfortunately, it feels like a step backwards. Visually, it's underwhelming. Compared to the Super Monaco GP games, there's less clarity, less detail, and overall it's harder to read what's happening on screen. Corners don't stand out as clearly, and the environment feels less defined. And it might not sound like the biggest issue, but in a racing game on a console with this tiny screen, visibility really is everything. If you can't clearly see what's coming, it becomes much harder to react, and that directly impacts how the game feels to play. And then there's the handling, and this is where the game really struggles. The controls feel awkward, the car doesn't respond as smoothly as you'd expect, and there's a sense that you're constantly fighting the game rather than working with it. The more you play, the more you realise the game just never quite settles into a rhythm. You're constantly making micro corrections, oversteering into corners, understeering on exit. It's like the car is always half a step out of sync with what you want it to actually do. And that becomes tiring over many races, because instead of just focusing on racing lines, braking points or overtakes, you're just trying to keep the damn thing pointing forward. There is some enjoyment to be found if you do stick with it. You can learn how to manage the awkwardness, and there are moments where everything clicks, even just for a lap, but it never quite becomes comfortable. Which is a shame, because by this point in this handheld F1 history, you'd expect things to be moving forward, not like shuffling sideways. Still, somehow, in Italy I finished P2. I don't know how, I don't know why, but at least the streak continues. At this point, second place is just becoming my default setting. Okay, so we're looking at one final original Game Boy title before we move into the world of Game Boy Color. So this is F1 Pole Position, and this is where things get a bit confusing, because Pole Position was of course a 1992 racing game on the SNES, but this is not a port of that game. This is actually a localization of a Game Boy Japanese title, which was actually Nakajima Satoru F1 Hero GB92, a sequel to, of course, the previous one, but Ubisoft just decided to use the F1 Pole Position name, but it isn't related to that game really at all. So technically this game was developed by Ferrari, but the localization was handled by Ubisoft and was published by Ubisoft, so we'll leave it at that, and it released in 1993. This one immediately I found incredibly hard, because the qualifying system just felt like it was trying to ruin my day. The handling was a bit awkward, so I went out, tried to set a lap, thought I did alright, and the game just says no, disqualified. No explanation, no warning, it's just kind of vibing about it, I guess. Eventually I did start to piece it together. I guess the track limits are extremely strict, even slightly running wide can invalidate your lap, which sure, yeah, realistic, but the game never tells you that, so instead of learning the system, you're just guessing what went wrong, on a system that shouldn't really have these kind of strict rules because the handling never really allows it. It turns qualifying into this weird trial and error process where you're not even sure what you're improving. But then you get into the race and it's actually kind of alright. The handling takes a bit of time to adjust to, but once it clicks, there's a satisfying flow. You can carry speed through corners, pick your moments to overtake, and actually feel like you're racing rather than surviving. There are also some nice touches like little pit animations, menu music that give the game a bit more character than you'd expect. It's just a shame that that first impression is so rough. Anyway, if you were interested, my personal best here was last, so I'm just not going to talk about it, and let's move on. Alright, so we're officially past the early chaos. We've survived the glitchy Game Boy era, the questionable handling, and somehow a ridiculous number of second place finishes or no finishes at all. Now things start to change. This is where handheld F1 games begin to feel less like experiments and more like actual racing games. Slightly better hardware, more ambition, and finally some developers starting to figure things out. So let's pick things back up in the year 2000. So this is F1 World Grand Prix. This game had a variety of different developers depending on the platform, and released on numerous different platforms, ranging from 1998 all the way up until 2000. Anyway, the Game Boy Color version was developed by Video System, and was published by them as well, releasing across 1999 and 2000 depending on where you lived in the world. Interestingly enough, this game was originally developed as an exclusive for the N64, which is kinda cool. Anyway, this game feels like a huge leap forward. You boot it up and immediately it feels like the hardware is finally starting to keep up with the ambition. First colour, some proper meaningful colour, cars are distinct, tracks have some personality, and everything is just a bit easier to read. It sounds simple, but after hours of monochrome racing, it makes a massive difference, trust me. And then you actually get on track, and the handling is, good. Not good for a handheld, but like, actually good. You can push the car, adjust mid-corner, recover from mistakes. There's a real sense of control, and more importantly, a sense of progression. You improve over time and you learn from mistakes, and then there's the depth. There's some decent setups, there's damage, full race weekends, practice sessions on a Game Boy Color. It's kind of ridiculous, but it works. And on top of that, finally, Brazil, P1. We actually won. After all the near misses and complete failures, it finally came together, and you know what? It felt deserved. Am I good at the game? No, but I finally won something. And then the next game immediately decides to humble me. This is F1 Racing Championship, another 2000 release Game Boy Color game, but this time developed by Ubisoft but still published by Video System. It looks great at first glance, bright colours, proper team liveries, and a presentation that feels like it's trying to mirror the real 2000 season. After the confidence boost of F1 World Grand Prix, you go in thinking, alright, more of that, but better. And in some ways, yeah it is. There's a lot going on here. You've got multiple modes like single race, full championship, time trial, and even scenario-based challenges. There's also a split between arcade and sim styles, which sounds like the perfect compromise for different types of players. But here's the thing, this game is hard. Like, properly hard. The handling is much less forgiving than World Grand Prix. The cars feel lighter but also more unstable, like they're constantly on the edge of losing grip. Corners that felt manageable before suddenly feel tight and punishing. You have to be way more precise with braking, steering and throttle, or you're just gone, like spinning, a lot. And it's not just you, the AI feels like it's been turned up to a completely different level. They're faster, more aggressive, and way less likely to make mistakes. You're not just racing them, you're just trying to survive them. Even in arcade mode, where you feel like things would be toned down a bit, it still feels like the game is demanding near perfect driving. There were multiple moments where I genuinely thought, have I just suddenly got worse at racing games? I mean, I was never good to begin with, but no, it's just this game. That said, there is something weirdly satisfying about how punishing it is, because when occasionally you do get it right, when you hook up a clean lap and hit every apex and keep the car under control, it feels incredible and you've earned that lap. The problem is consistency. Getting one good lap is doable, but stringing together a full race without mistakes, that's where things get tricky. This is one of those games that definitely rewards patience and precision, but it definitely leans more toward frustration than fun at times. However, if you're the kind of player that enjoys a challenge, I'd say there's a lot to sink your teeth into here, and it is still a good game. I was just very bad at it. And that said, yeah, I didn't win anything here, guys. It was terrible. Okay, so after that experience, this is F1 World Grand Prix 2, and this feels like a breath of fresh air. So this version of the game was developed by Video System and once again published by them, and released across 2000. Yeah, the Game Boy Color had a weirdly large amount of F1 games released in the span of 1 year. Anyway, this is the kind of sequel that doesn't try and reinvent everything, it just refines what already works. Visually it's very similar to the first game, which is a good thing. It's clean, it's colourful, it's easy to read. Everything you want on a small screen. But there are subtle improvements. The presentation feels tighter, the UI is a bit cleaner, and overall it just feels a bit more polished. And then you get on track, and the handling is immediately familiar but slightly more demanding. It's not a massive change, but it is noticeable. The cars feel a bit heavier, a bit more planted, but also less forgiving if you overcommit to a corner. You have to be more deliberate with your inputs, which makes it more satisfying because when you get it right, it actually feels like you're driving and not just reacting. All the features return as well, so full setups, damage options, full race weekends, practices, everything that made the first game feel so complete is still here. And that's what makes this such a strong sequel. It doesn't try to fix what wasn't broken, it just builds on it. Of course the results weren't quite as strong this time, but Silverstone we still achieved P3. And honestly, given the increased difficulty, that felt like an achievement to me. This is one of those games where finishing on the podium actually feels meaningful. And it's not like in some earlier games where if you don't win the race, the game just berates you. It will still celebrate your podium finishes even if that podium isn't the first position. Okay, so now we move on to the Game Boy Advance, and this is where things take another big leap. This is F1 2002, a game developed by Visual Science and published by EA Sports. It released on the original Xbox, PC, PS2, GameCube, and finally of course the Game Boy Advance, with those versions coming later in late 2002 and early 2003, depending on where you lived in the world. This is a game that immediately made me question how it was even running on this hardware, because this isn't just like a little upgrade, it's like a full step forward in terms of scope and ambition. The first thing that stands out is the perspective and scale. You've got a proper third-person camera, detailed car models, and tracks that feel far more complex than anything we've seen on Game Boy hardware before. And somehow, it actually runs smoothly. The frame rate holds up, even with multiple cars on screen, and the sense of speed is much more convincing. And then there's the handling. At first it can feel a bit awkward, the cars are more sensitive, there's more movement, and it takes time to adjust. You can't just throw the car into corners, you have to be more precise. But once it clicks, it's really satisfying. You start thinking about racing lines, braking points, how to carry speed through corners. It actually feels like a proper step towards simulation compared to earlier handheld titles. And then you've got the features, setup options, difficulty settings, enough customization to tailor the experience to your level. It's not overwhelming, but it does add some depth. This is the point where handheld F1 games stop feeling like impressive for what they are, and start feeling like legitimately good racing games. And my best finish here was P2 at Silverstone. I could have had P1, but I kept making some stupid ass mistakes quite late into the race that nearly cost me the podium entirely. But we still got P2, so I'll take the win. So now we are moving on to the PSP, and the PSP does have a few F1 games released for it, and one of them we have actually covered in a full video before, and that was the first F1 game for the system, F1 Grand Prix. So this is Formula 1 06, which is also known as Formula 1 2006 Portable, and this was developed by Studio Liverpool and published by Sony, releasing in 2006. So of course, this was a complete jump up from the Game Boy Advance, which of course makes sense. This feels like a console game that just happens to be portable, which of course was the whole point of the PSP. Visually it's a huge step up, there's detailed cars, some proper lighting, more realistic tracks. It looks like a proper F1 game, not a scaled down version. And more importantly, it actually plays well. The handling is smooth and responsive, there's a real sense of control. You can push the car, feel the limits, and actually race with confidence. One of the best things here is the accessibility. You've got a wide range of difficulty settings and driving assists. Whether you want a more arcade style experience or something closer to simulation, the game lets you adjust it, and that makes a massive difference, because instead of fighting the game, you're shaping it to suit how you want to play. The AI is also well balanced, competitive but fair. You can battle them properly, make moves, defend positions. It feels like actual racing. And then, in Bahrain, we claim P1, a clean, controlled race from start to finish. Mostly. No weird mechanics, no frustration, just a genuinely good racing experience. And this is the point where handheld F1 games fully arrive. So today we are looking at one final game, and that is F1 2011. Now this actually had two different handheld versions, and that's on the PS Vita and the 3DS. And today we're looking at the 3DS version because I don't actually own a Vita and emulation on the Vita is not the best yet. So anyway, this is F1 2011. It released across Windows, PS3, Xbox 360, and then of course the 3DS and the Vita, as well as iOS, across 2011 and 2012. The home console versions were developed by Codemasters, and the handheld versions were developed by Sumo Digital, who you may know from the Sonic and All-Stars Racing series, as well as Outrun 2006 Coast to Coast, so these guys know what they're doing. So this is one of those games where you can immediately tell what it wants to be. This isn't just a scaled down, we'll do what we can kind of handheld racer. This is aiming to be a proper modern F1 experience, just on a smaller dual screen setup. And honestly, when you first boot it up, it does kind of sell that idea. Visually, it's kind of impressive for the 3DS, the cars look detailed enough, you've got recognisable liveries, and the tracks have a decent amount of depth to them. There's a clear attempt to match what home console F1 games were doing at the time, just compressed into a handheld format. Menus feel more modern, presentation feels cleaner, and overall it gives a strong first impression. This feels like the future compared to where we started, but then you get on track and things start to, well, unravel immediately. The first thing you notice is the handling, or more specifically how slidey it is, and not in a fun controlled arcade way. It's the kind of slidey where you're constantly questioning whether the track is made of tarmac or ice. You turn in, and instead of the car gripping and following your input, it just kind of drifts. You try to correct and suddenly you're overcorrecting. You try to stabilize it and now you're sliding the other way. It becomes this constant balancing act where you're never quite in control. And that's the biggest issue because in a racing game, confidence is everything. You want to feel like if you hit your braking point, take the right line and apply throttle smoothly, you'll be rewarded, and here it just feels like a gamble. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, and you're not always sure why. And the longer you play, the more you realise that it's not really a learning curve, it's just how the game is built. You can kind of adapt to it, sure, you can start to anticipate the sliding and drive more cautiously, but that comes at a cost because instead of driving fast, you're just driving carefully, and that's not quite the same thing. And then there's the AI, which somehow manages to be just as inconsistent. Some races they're completely passive, you breeze past them, take the lead early, and it feels almost too easy. And then other races, they're suddenly on another level, pulling away, defending aggressively, you know, like they've just turned into prime championship contenders out of nowhere. It's just extremes, which makes it really hard to settle into a rhythm across a championship or even a few races because you never quite know what you're gonna get. It's just inconsistent, and that's the theme of this game. It's not completely broken, it's not bad, it's just really uneven. And that's almost more frustrating because you can see exactly what it could have been, a fully realised handheld F1 experience. Instead, it ends up being a mix of good ideas and questionable execution. And yet, despite all of that, I did manage a P1 finish at Australia. And that's what makes it even weirder, because even with the slidey handling, the game still gives you moments where everything comes together. So yeah, that's the interestingly insane world of handheld F1 games. From barely functioning experiments on early handhelds to ambitious, almost console-like experiences on systems like the PSP and 3DS. And along the way, we've really seen everything. Games that pushed hardware to limits, games that aimed way too high, and games that were surprisingly great, and others that were, well, not so great. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to leave a like, and if you haven't done so already, subscribe and tap that bell for notifications to stay up to date with my future uploads. A massive shout out to my Patreon subscribers, and all I really have left to say is thank you, and goodbye.